20th century has been the most violent in the history of our planet. In no other century has war been so widespread or caused so much loss of life and suffering. While the human race has grown ever more sophisticated, increasing knowledge of ourselves, our world, and the universe about us, the last 100 years have also reinforced the grim fact that war remains a prime human activity. Dominating all the many conflicts have been the two world wars. The Great War of 1914-18 is remembered above all for the slaughter on the Western Front in France and Flanders. Literally millions of soldiers lost their lives in the repeated efforts to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Not until the last year of the war did new weapons and tactics make this possible. But the war was fought on many other fronts as well. There was the titanic struggle between Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary along a front which stretched for over 1,000 miles, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Russian, too, fought Turk in the wastelands of Armenia. The Balkans, where the spark which set the war in train was lit, saw much conflict. There was fighting, too, in the mountains of northern Italy. The war also took in the deserts of the Middle East, the African bush, and even, briefly, China. The war at sea covered most of the world's oceans at one time or another. In 1914, ships of the German fleet had to be hunted down in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Mediterranean and Black Sea also saw much naval activity, as did the Baltic. It was the North Sea and North Atlantic, however, to which the attention of both sides was mainly focused. The British Grand Fleet had aimed to draw the German High Seas Fleet into battle and destroy it, but not until May 1916 was it successful, when at Jutland the two fleets clashed, both suffering heavy casualties. After this, the German fleet did not venture out of port again, except to surrender at the end of the war. By 1916, however, two other naval weapons, apart from surface warships, had made their impact. The first was the mine, which accounted for scores of ships, both fighting and merchant. The second was the submarine. During the early part of the war, its targets were enemy warships, and it enjoyed much success. But increasingly, at least as far as the Germans were concerned, it was used against commerce, especially in the Atlantic. At one point in spring 1917, the losses in British merchant vessels were so high that there were fears that the country might starve. Britain was saved from running out of food by convoying and improved anti-submarine tactics. In contrast, the Allied naval blockade of Germany did cause gradual starvation. Civilians were to suffer more directly from another, but new medium of war, in the air. In 1914, the aircraft was used by armies and navies mainly for reconnaissance. Soon, though, aircraft found themselves having to fight for information, and the result was the Fighting Scout, whose exploits, especially over the Western Front, caught the imagination of the world. Airmen soon realized that they had the means to carry the war to the enemy's homeland in a way that armies and navies could not. This began with the attacks by Zeppelins on England in 1915, and then was taken up by long-range bombing aircraft. This put civilians in the firing line as they had never been before. The bomber had become the weapon of the future. The conflict of 1914-18 cost the lives of some 9 million. $20 million others, weakened by shortage of food and general exhaustion, died in the Spanish flu epidemic which swept the world in late 1918. Most people believe that such had been the horrors of 1914-18, that it must be the war to end all wars. To this end, the peacemakers in Paris in early 1919 redrew the world's map, instituted measures to ensure that militarism among the vanquished nations was crushed, and set up the League of Nations. Yet the seeds for another major European conflict were being sown. Out of civil unrest, new ideologies were taking root. Communism, fascism, and Nazism. These were to be the driving force behind the next and even more terrible global war that broke out just 20 years later. Not only did ideology make the Second World War a much more ruthless affair than its predecessor, but ever-advancing technology made weaponry much more lethal than in 1914-18. Furthermore, developments in motive power and communications often made the pace of war very much faster than before, be it on land, sea, or in the air. 1939-45 also had an even greater global nature than the Great War. In Europe, at least from mid-1941 onwards, it was the Eastern Front which dominated the war on land. Here, a mighty struggle between two rival ideologies was waged to the death, with the battlefront first reaching the outskirts of Moscow, and then, as the tide turned, westwards to Berlin itself. The short campaign in the West in spring 1940 was in sharp contrast to 1914-18 in the swiftness of the German victory. It resulted in all Western Europe, together with Norway and Denmark, coming under the German thrall. The Balkans, too, came under Axis domination as a result of another blitzkrieg campaign in April 1941. In all these countries, as in Eastern Europe and Western Russia, resistance movements and partisan bands sprang up, encouraged and sustained by Russia and the Western Allies, and these provided another facet to the nature of warfare, 1939 to 45. During the latter half of the war, Italy witnessed a tough and grinding campaign, which started in the Toe and ended in the Alps. The fighting around Monte Cassino was some of the fiercest of the war. The Mediterranean witnessed numerous naval clashes as the British fought with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, for control of it. Across the Mediterranean was the North African theatre. Here, the British fought the Axis in a backwards and forwards campaign, which lasted for 2.5 years. The landings in French Northwest Africa in November 1942 represented the first joint Anglo-American enterprise in the European theatre. They paved the way for the short but bitter campaign in Tunisia during winter 1942-43. The result was the clearance of the whole of the southern shore of the Mediterranean by early May 1943. Finally, there was the creation, with the landings in Normandy and southern France, of the Second Front in summer 1944. This advance by the Western Allies would eventually join hands with the Russians on the River Elbe and bring about the end of the war with Germany. Running in parallel with all these campaigns were the two longest of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic represented a second round in the struggle to secure the Atlantic sea lanes against Germany's U-boats. The main aim of the strategic bombing campaign was to cripple Germany's ability to wage war through attacks by night and day. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the American Pacific Fleet base in Hawaii, in December 1941, not only brought America into the war, but also opened up what was in many ways a separate war to that in Europe. Furthermore, it added another huge dimension to a war that was already being waged between the Japanese and Chinese in China itself, and had been since 1937. The initial Japanese onrush swamped the British possessions in the Far East, the American islands in the Pacific, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. It brought the war to the doorstep of far-off Australia. Then came the long fight back, which entailed a seemingly endless series of amphibious operations to wrest back the Pacific Islands from Japanese control. There was a parallel slog through the jungles of Burma. Eventually, by summer 1945, the Allies were approaching the Japanese mainland. But Japan's surrender was only achieved by the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Their advent heralded the prospect of a new and even more terrible form of warfare. The war left much of Europe and the Far East devastated. It cost the lives of 55 million people, and in contrast to 1914-18, nearly two-thirds of this total were civilians. Of these, many perished in Hitler's concentration camps, Stalin's labor camps, and the Japanese internment camps. The Jews suffered worst. About half the pre-war Jewish population of Europe did not survive the war. The 20th century has seen many other conflicts besides the two world wars. There have been conventional wars between states. In the first few years of the century, the Russians fought the Japanese and suffered a devastating naval defeat, as depicted in this very early film. This marked the beginning of Japan's 40 years as a world military power. There were two wars in the Balkans on the eve of the Great War. The first to remove the last vestiges of Turkish rule from the area, the second a squabble among the victorious states over territory wrested from the Turks. In more recent times, Israel fought 4 wars with her Arab neighbors in her first 25 years as an independent state. India and Pakistan have clashed on a number of occasions. There was also the costly and protracted war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. Another form of warfare prevalent in this century has been wars of self-determination, involving peoples throwing off the yoke of rule by others. These became widespread with the breakup of the European colonial empires after World War II. The French fought such a campaign in Indochina. The British waged a long, drawn-out conflict in Malaya. The Portuguese tried for years to hold down Mozambique and Angola. It has, however, not always been Western empires which have been under attack. The 1956 Hungarian uprising was as much against Soviet domination of the country as it was against its own authoritarian government. Likewise, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan resisted the Soviet occupation forces during the 1980s and eventually forced them to withdraw. Nations have fought internal civil wars throughout history, and the 20th century has had more than its fair share of what is often one of the most brutal forms of war. The Russian Civil War caused untold suffering as it flowed backwards and forwards, as did the Spanish Civil War, where the suffering was made worse by the intervention of the Germans, Italians and Russians with their modern weaponry. China was racked by civil war during the 1920s, and indeed enjoyed no peace until the communists finally overcame Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. There was the civil war in Cuba in the 1950s, which eventually saw Fidel Castro topple President Batista. In Nigeria in the late 1960s, tribal differences brought about a 4-year bloody conflict between the federal forces and the breakaway state of Biafra. The last 20 years have shown only too clearly how merciless civil war can be, and how difficult it is to stop before one side has achieved total victory. In Lebanon, Beirut has been reduced to a shell of its former self. Some of the republics of the former Soviet Union have suffered constant turmoil. The struggles in former Yugoslavia have been marked by their brutality. Another form of conflict is terrorism. The causes of this have been varied. Arab terrorism against Israel is designed to force the Israelis to give up territories they have occupied since the 1973 war. The IRA in Ireland see the British as an occupying power and believe that the bomb and the bullet are the only way to achieve the reunification of Ireland. Others, like the Red Brigades in Italy in the 1970s, have committed outrages for ideological reasons. More recently, another brand of terrorism has made itself felt, especially in Central America, that of the drug barons, whose object is to prevent governments from interfering with their operations. The final main form of 20th century warfare was never actually a war in which two sides fought one another on the battlefield, although they spent over 40 years preparing and training to do so. The Cold War began almost as soon as the Second World War ended and resulted in Europe becoming two armed camps, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Not until the end of 1989, when the fortified borders between East and West Europe came down, did it end. The United Nations, successor to the League, has tried to prevent conflict. When North Korea invaded its southern neighbor in 1950, an American-led UN force was deployed just in time to prevent South Korea from being totally overrun. It took 3 years fighting to restore peace. Similarly, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 was answered by the massing of a huge UN-backed force, again under American command, which drove the Iraqis out. The UN's main role has been peacekeeping. Over the years, its blue beret soldiers have become familiar sights in the trouble spots of the world. Recently, UN troops have found themselves engaged in humanitarian work in Somalia and in former Yugoslavia, escorting food convoys and evacuating refugees. These activities, and possibly the more difficult task of peacemaking as well, are likely to keep the UN at full stretch for the foreseeable future. The first main technological influence on 20th century warfare was the internal combustion engine. By 1914, motor vehicles were commonplace, but armies were still mainly reliant on the horse and their feet for motive power. In this respect, there was little to tell them apart from those of Napoleon's time 100 years before. One major difference, though, was that long-distance movement was done by rail, enabling armies to be quickly deployed. The land weapons of 1914 were, however, very different to those of 1814. The machine gun and magazine rifle were many times more lethal than the smooth-bore musket. Breech-loading artillery, firing high explosive and shrapnel, could cause destruction very much more widespread than the solid shot of the muzzle-loaded cannon. Only the cavalryman, with his sword and lance, had not radically changed his weapons over the past century. The new firepower that armies enjoyed was a major reason for the advent of trench warfare at the end of 1914, and this itself produced a range of new weapons. There were mortars, able to fire high explosive bombs into trenches with often devastating effect. Hand grenades, used extensively 200 years earlier, were revived, and flamethrowers introduced. Attempts to break the deadlock of trench warfare resulted in the development of the tank in 1916. While it lacked the speed and mechanical reliability to have a truly decisive effect on operations, its potential was recognized, and it would exert an enormous influence on land warfare in the future. By 1939, the internal combustion engine had reached such efficiency that some armies had almost forsaken the horse, although the Germans, for one, continued to rely heavily on it throughout the war. The tank now exerted a significant influence on the pace of operations and grew ever more powerful as the war progressed. Matching this was the development of anti-tank weapons, both guns and, by the end of the war, handheld recoilless launchers. Mechanized warfare also led to the construction of self-propelled guns. To enable infantry to keep up with the tanks, armored personnel carriers were produced. The infantryman's weapons were also made lighter, a trend that has continued since 1945. A new generation of light machine guns came into being, simpler to operate and less liable to jam than their 1914-18 predecessors. The submachine gun also came into wide general use as a close combat weapon. Mortars, too, were very different to the earlier cumbersome trench weapons, and artillery guns also tended to be more compact and mobile. A new form of artillery, the multiple launched rocket system, was introduced. This continues to be used today. Mechanized warfare continued to dominate thinking after 1945, especially in NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It was, however, the Middle East which became the laboratory of armored warfare, and it was not until 1991 that the Western powers were able to personally prove their latest tanks in battle here. As for anti-tank weapons, the most significant change since 1945 has been the switch from guns to guided missiles. The changeover began in the 1960s, and modern systems like the American TOW and Russian Saga can kill a tank at ranges of 3,000 to 4,000 meters. Communications technology has been transformed. Semaphore and the heliograph were extensively used in the 1900s. A few primitive radios were introduced during the Great War, but the field telephone was the main means of communication during 1914-18. But its cables were very vulnerable to shell fire. During 1939-45, combat radio began to come into its own, first on armored vehicles and then for the infantry. Nowadays, combat radios are ever more versatile, and headquarters also use computerization, fax, and even satellite communications. Perhaps one of the most sophisticated systems is to be found on the Airborne Warning and Control System, AWACS aircraft. Navies, too, have witnessed dramatic changes during the past 100 years. At the turn of the century, they consisted of three main types of surface vessel: the battleship, around which the fleet was built, and the cruiser, which protected the battleships against attacks by torpedo boat destroyers. Cruisers were also the eyes of the fleet. There were, however, two other threats to the surface warship. The first of these was the sea mine, which had been gradually developed over the 19th century. The other was the submarine. The concept of an underwater vessel was not new, but the first truly modern submarine was developed by the American John Holland and entered U.S. naval service in 1900. By 1914, the submarine had become an effective weapon of war. By 1914, a number of warships had been equipped with float planes to enable them to see over the horizon. But in 1917, the British converted a cruiser, the Furious, into an aircraft carrier, which could carry a number of aircraft and keep up with the fleet. One other significant aspect of naval technology during 1914-18 was fuel. Before the war, the majority of warships used coal, which had several drawbacks. Apart from the telltale black smoke and dirt, there was the need for coaling stations when operating away from home waters. By 1914, with abundant oil now available from the Persian Gulf, more and more warships began to change to this type of fuel, which was cleaner, easier to handle, and generally more efficient. When war did come again in 1939, many naval aspects were to be a repeat of 1914-18. Mine warfare was waged even more intensely, the mines themselves becoming ever more sophisticated. By 1945, not just the traditional contact mine was employed, but types that reacted to a ship's magnetic signature, the noise of its engines, and even to changes to the pressure of the water through which it was passing. the submarine became an even more formidable weapon than during 1914-18. Its main weaknesses were that its underwater speed was often slower than that of its prey, and that it had to surface to recharge its batteries, since it used electric power underwater. By the end of the war, the Germans had overcome these problems, although too late to affect the issue. Anti-submarine warfare also took great strides forward. ASDIC, or sonar, detected submarines underwater, while depth charges became ever more lethal. Air power had the greatest influence on naval surface warfare. Ships sailing within range of hostile shores were especially vulnerable, and warships were forced to add numerous anti-aircraft guns to their armament. It was, however, the aircraft carrier which dominated by the middle of the war. Fleet carriers enabled opposing fleets to engage one another at very long range. Battleships lost their pride of place and increasingly found themselves relegated to protecting the fleet carriers from air attack. Not until the 1980s did the battleship enjoy a brief comeback as a shore bombardment platform. One final aspect of the naval technology of World War II is amphibious shipping. Much of the war involved landings on hostile shores, but at the outset of the war, no nation possessed the necessary landing craft. By 1945, the Western Allies had built up a vast armada of specialist amphibious shipping. The greatest revolution since 1945 has been the emergence of the missile as the prime weapon for the surface warship. Anti-ship missiles can also be fired from aircraft, helicopters and submarines, and can cause enormous devastation. Ship-borne surface-to-air missiles can take out both hostile aircraft and missiles. Electronic measures to counter these missiles have also been developed. Jamming the missile's controlling radar, flares, and chaff being fired here are some of these. Some larger warships were designed with a new form of propulsion, nuclear. The first of these was the USS Long Beach, which was launched in 1961. Nuclear power is most used in submarines. These come in two types, the SSBN nuclear ballistic submarine and the hunter-killer SSN. Nuclear-powered submarines are significantly faster than the traditional diesel-electric boat, which still exists, and have well over 10 times the steaming range. One of the most dramatic advances in the 20th century has been the development of the heavier-than-air flying machine. While hot air balloons had been developed in the late 18th century, the internal combustion engine gave balloons powered flight. It was, however, not until the Wright brothers made their epic first flight in December 1903 in North Carolina that the aircraft, as we know it, came into being. The military potential of the aircraft was quickly seen, and by 1910, a number of nations were using them for reconnaissance. The airship, though, had greater range and payload over the aircraft. In 1914, the military aircraft was still primitive, with fragile wooden frame, unarmed, and capable of speeds of no more than 80 miles per hour. Speed did not radically increase during the war. Indeed, 1918 types could still fly at no more than 125 miles per hour. Aircraft, however, were given ever more roles and began to be designed primarily with these in mind. One was the fighter. Another was the photographic reconnaissance aircraft. The bomber also came into being and brought about a dramatic increase in aircraft range. In 1915, strategic bombing was carried out by Zeppelin airships, since they outranged aircraft. 2 years later, German bombers were attacking Britain. Italian aircraft were overflying the Alps to drop bombs on Austria, and British and French bombers were attacking Germany. The drive for ever-increased aircraft range continued after the war. Aviators like Charles Lindbergh became worldwide household names for their epic flights. In conjunction with this, air routes were gradually opened up throughout the world. For a time, the airship rivaled the aircraft as a long-haul airliner. But the crash of the British R-101 in France in 1931 and the disaster that befell the German von Hindenburg in 1937 caused a wide-scale loss of confidence in this form of air transport. Speed, too, was pursued. Here the focus was the annual Schneider Trophy races for seaplanes. In 1931, the British Supermarine S-6B won it with a speed of 340 miles an hour. It was from the design experience gained from these races that the metal frame monoplane fighters of World War II were largely developed. Their arrival and that of radar, which gave advance warning of an attack, enabled the popular cry between the wars that the bomber will always get through to be disproved. This forced both British and German bombers to operate largely by night. The Americans, on the other hand, remained wedded to the belief that heavily armed bombers could operate by day and with better bombing accuracy. Not, however, until long-range escort fighters were introduced in 1944 were they able to do so without risking heavy aircraft casualties. In mid-1944, the first jets appeared. The fastest plane of the whole war, however, was not a jet, but a rocket aircraft, the German Me-163 Comet, which had a maximum speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The Germans developed rocketry on a much wider scale. Two such weapons which made their appearance in the summer of 1944 were the V-1 pilotless aircraft and the V-2 rocket. One other development in World War II was that of the helicopter. The concept of vertical takeoff and landing had been successfully put into practice with the autogyro between the wars, but this could not hover. The Americans and Germans produced true helicopters during the war, but their roles were very limited. It was not until the Korean War and Vietnam that the helicopter developed into the truly multi-role air vehicle that we recognize today. By the early 1950s, the jet had taken over from the piston engine in combat aircraft, and the first true jet versus jet actions took place in Korea. Since then, the air-to-air missile has superseded the gun as the fighter's main weapon. These are normally heat-seeking and are attracted by the aircraft's exhausts. Air-to-ground weapons have also become increasingly sophisticated. In the late 1960s, the Americans used smart weapons to attack bridges in North Vietnam, with mixed results. It was in the 1991 Gulf War that they really proved their effectiveness in taking out pinpoint targets. As for aircraft themselves, three recent developments stand out. The first was the development of the vertical takeoff and landing fighter aircraft in the shape of the British Harrier. The second is the swing wing, or variable geometry aircraft, which gives it the best possible performance in all conditions. Finally, there is stealth technology, designed to make the aircraft invisible to radar. Of all the awesome weapons developed during this century, three categories stand out above all: chemical, biological, and nuclear.
Fire!
Chemical weapons came into prominence during 1914-18, when mustard gas and chlorine were used extensively by both sides, causing many casualties. They were not used in World War II for fear of retaliation, but since then they have been used in Vietnam as a defoliant of forests and by the Iraqis in the Middle East. Biological weapons involve the use of disease-producing microorganisms. They have never been used in war. Even so, they exist. A Scottish island on which anthrax experiments were carried out during World War II remains uninhabitable. The spectre of nuclear warfare dominated the 45 years of Cold War. Each side strove to outmatch the other in its nuclear armory. But the end of the Cold War has not removed the threat. A number of nations now have a nuclear capability. The last decade of the century has also seen a new form of warfare: environmental. This has awesome potential for the future. Technology has transformed warfare in this century. Who is to say what it can do in the next?